Welcome. Tonight's tale is not just a story. It is a real-life incident buried in California's dark past. In 1839, the Whitaker family built a home near an ancient grove, unaware of the curse that lingered there. What followed is a nightmare that still echoes through history. Close your eyes and listen. The shadows are waiting. Shadows over the valley. The year was 1839, and the California wilderness was vast, untamed, and eerily quiet. The region around the Sacramento Valley was barely touched by settlers, its thick forests and sprawling fields ruled by silence and mystery. This was a time before the gold rush, when only a handful of families had dared to stake their lives in the wild lands of the West. Among them was the Whitaker family, a man named Thomas, his wife Eleanor, and their two children, a boy of 12 named Samuel and his younger sister Clara, just 8. They had built a modest home at the edge of a dense grove of ancient oak trees, trees so old and knotted that the native tribes warned of spirits living among them. The tribe spoke of Oki, a wandering spirit that was neither alive nor dead, a presence that fed on fear and despair. But the Whitakers, like many early settlers, dismissed these stories as superstition. Their days were filled with hard work, harvesting, hunting, and building a life in the unforgiving wilderness. At night, however, when the wind howled through the valley and the moonlight stretched the shadows across their land, the family could not shake the feeling that they were not alone. It was on a particularly still night in late October of 1839 that everything began. The day had been unusually quiet. No birds, no rustle of animals in the brush, just an oppressive silence that seemed to weigh down on the valley. As night fell, Thomas sat by the fire, sharpening his axe, while Eleanor stitched patches into Samuel's worn jacket. The children had already gone to bed, but as the flames flickered, Thomas noticed something. His shadow, cast on the cabin wall, seemed to move when he didn't. At first, he thought it was his tired mind playing tricks, but then it happened again. His own silhouette stretched unnaturally across the room, bending and twitching as though it had a life of its own. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice tight. "Do you see that?" She looked up from her sewing, her eyes falling on the shifting shape. Her lips parted, but no words came. For a moment, both of them were frozen in silence, the fire crackling as the shadow writhed like a living creature. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the shadow snapped back into place. Eleanor swallowed hard. "Maybe it's just the firelight," she said, though her voice trembled. But Thomas knew something was wrong. That night, neither of them slept well. Around midnight, they heard soft scratching on the walls outside. It wasn't the sound of an animal. No, this was deliberate, like fingernails dragging across wood. He grabbed his rifle and stepped outside, but there was nothing. The forest was black and endless, the air thick with a strange metallic scent. The following days grew stranger. Samuel complained of hearing whispers in the grove, voices calling his name from deep within the trees. Clara would wake up crying, saying that a tall, dark figure stood at the foot of her bed, watching her in silence. Eleanor tried to reassure them, but each night she, too, felt an unseen presence in the cabin. Shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. Corners of the room felt too dark, and the wind carried whispers that made no sense. One evening, Thomas ventured into the woods to hunt, but as he reached the grove, he felt a sudden chill, as if the very air was being drained of warmth. The trees, which had always stood still, seemed to sway with no wind. He thought he heard footsteps behind him, but each time he turned, there was nothing, only the dark, gnarled trunks of the ancient oaks. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted unnaturally. He raised his rifle, but the figure melted into the trees, as though it was part of the shadows themselves. That night, Thomas didn't speak of what he saw. He simply bolted the door and sat by the fire, staring into the flames as if afraid they might go out. Eleanor noticed his silence, the way his hands trembled. She wanted to ask, but something told her she didn't want to know. A week later, Samuel disappeared. It happened at dawn. Eleanor had stepped outside to fetch water from the well, and when she returned, Samuel's bed was empty. At first, she thought he had gone outside, but there were no footprints, no sign of him anywhere. Thomas and Eleanor searched for hours, calling his name, but the forest swallowed their voices. Then they heard it, a child's laughter, distant, echoing from the grove. It was Samuel's voice, but it was wrong. The laughter was twisted, strained, as though coming from something that only knew how to mimic a human sound. Thomas ran toward the grove with his rifle, calling out for his son, but the deeper he went, the darker the woods became, until it felt as though night had fallen in the middle of the day. He saw movement ahead, a glimpse of Samuel's small figure standing among the trees. But as Thomas approached, the boy turned, and his eyes were pitch black, his face pale and hollow as if drained of all life. "Papa," the boy said, but the voice was not his. It was deep, distorted, and wrong. Thomas froze. The figure smiled, an unnatural, too wide smile, and then it vanished, dissolving into the shadows. When he returned to the cabin, empty-handed and shaking, Eleanor knew. Samuel was gone. Not lost, not taken by any animal, but claimed by whatever dark presence haunted the grove. That night, they could hear Samuel's voice outside the cabin, calling for them, begging to be let in. Eleanor wept, but Thomas knew it wasn't their son anymore. In the weeks that followed, the family unraveled. Clara became pale and sickly, refusing to sleep. She claimed Samuel came to her window at night, whispering to her, promising he would take her with him soon. Thomas and Eleanor barely spoke, both consumed by fear and grief. On the final night, the shadows returned. The cabin was filled with them, stretching across the walls like living creatures, twisting and clawing at the air. The whispers grew louder, voices overlapping, chanting in a language neither of them understood. Clara screamed as the shadows crept toward her bed, and Thomas, desperate, grabbed his rifle and fired into the darkness. The sound of the shot echoed through the valley, but it didn't matter. The shadows swallowed the light, the cabin, everything. By morning, the Whitaker homestead was empty. The neighbors who came to check on them found the cabin abandoned, the walls covered in strange black marks, as though something had burned itself into the wood. No trace of the family was ever found. Some say the grove still stands, its trees older and darker than ever. At night, travelers claim to hear a boy's laughter echoing through the valley, or the sound of something scratching at the walls of their tents. The legend of the Whitakers became a warning, passed down for generations. Don't wander into the shadows of the valley, for some things are older than man, and they hunger for the living. Here is the second real-life incident: shadows over Hollow Creek, 1846. The year was 1846, and California was still a vast, untamed wilderness. In the shadow of rugged mountains and misty forests lay a remote valley known as Hollow Creek, a place few dared to enter. The land was beautiful but heavy, as if holding secrets it did not want to reveal. Even the local tribes refused to hunt there, claiming that the soil was cursed, haunted by an ancient shadow called Oki. But Thomas Whitaker did not believe in curses. with his wife Eleanor and their children, 12-year-old Samuel and 8-year-old Clara. He built a small wooden cabin at the edge of the dark oak grove. They were among the first to settle near Hollow Creek, determined to carve out a life from the wilderness. From their very first night, something felt wrong. Part 1. The first, as the air was unnaturally still. Not a single cricket sang, no wolf howled in the distance, not even the rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was as though the entire forest held its breath. Eleanor was the first to sense it. As she sat near the fire, sewing Samuel's jacket, she noticed the shadows on the wall didn't quite match the flicker of the flames. One moment, they were still. The next, they seemed to stretch, curling along the walls as though they had a life of their own. "Thomas," she whispered, "look at the walls." Thomas looked up from sharpening his axe. At first, he thought it was just the shifting firelight. But then he saw it. His own shadow twitched, its arms bending at angles he wasn't moving, its head tilting unnaturally. He froze. The room seemed colder, the silence heavier. Then, just as suddenly, the shadow snapped back into place. "Must be the fire," he muttered, though he didn't believe his own words. Eleanor nodded but kept glancing nervously at the walls for the rest of the night. Part 2. Whispers in the grove. As days passed, Samuel began to act strangely. He would sit on the porch, staring into the dark oak grove as though listening to something. "Papa," he asked one evening, "who lives in those trees?" "No one, son," Thomas replied. "It's just a forest." Samuel shook his head. "No, they call my name. They say, 'Samuel, come play with us.'" Eleanor's heart sank. She had heard nothing, but the boy's pale face told her he was not lying. That tea night, Clara began waking in tears. "Mama," she sobbed, "a tall man stands at my window. He doesn't move. He just looks at me." Eleanor would rush to comfort her, but outside the window, there was never anything. Part 3. A figure in the W's. One misty afternoon, Thomas took his rifle and went hunting near the grove. As he approached the trees, the air grew icy cold, his breath visible even though the sun was still shining. The silence was unbearable. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, behind him. Thomas spun around. Nothing. Only the twisted, black bark of the old oaks. But then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs elongated, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Its body seemed less flesh and more shadow, like smoke solidified into something living. Thomas raised his rifle, but the figure melted into the trees, vanishing as though it had never been there. When he returned home, he said nothing of what he saw. But that night, he bolted the cabin door and sat awake, staring into the fire until dawn. Part 4. The day. It was just after sunrise when Samuel vanished. Eleanor had gone to fetch water from the well, and when she returned, his bed was empty. There were no footprints, no broken twigs, no sign of him anywhere. They searched the woods for hours, calling his name. Then they heard it. A child's laughter, distant and faint, drifting from deep inside the grove. It was Samuel's voice, but wrong. Stretched, hollow, like something trying to imitate him. "Papa," the voice called. "Come find me." Thomas ran toward the sound, his rifle clutched in shaking hands. The deeper he went, the darker the grove became, even though the morning sun still shone beyond the trees. Then he saw him. Samuel stood among the trees, but something was wrong. His skin was pale, his eyes black as coal, and his smile was too wide. "Papa," Samuel said, but the voice was not his. It was deep, distorted, like many voices speaking at once. Thomas froze. His heart pounded. The boy tilted his head unnaturally, then dissolved into the shadows. Part 5. The final. Eleanor wept when Thomas returned alone. That night, the cabin was alive with terror. Scratching noises came from the walls, whispers filled the air, and Samuel's voice called from outside, begging to be let in. "Let me in, Mama. I'm cold." Eleanor sobbed, but Thomas held her back. "That's not our boy," he said, his voice breaking. The shadows in the cabin grew longer, darker, twisting and clawing as if they were alive. Clara screamed as a tall, dark figure emerged from the corner of the room, its limbs stretching toward her. Thomas fired his rifle, but the shot vanished into the dark like it had hit nothing. The last thing Eleanor heard was a whisper, right beside her ear. "All of you belong to me now." By morning, the cabin was empty. EPA and neighbors from nearby settlements came to check on the Whitakers. They found the cabin abandoned. The walls were covered in strange black handprints, and the oak grove felt heavier than ever. No trace of the family was ever found to this day. Travelers passing through Hollow Creek report hearing the laughter of children or seeing a tall, dark figure moving just beyond the trees. Some claim they hear a voice calling softly from the shadows, "Come play with us." Third real-life incident I hear that was the Curse of Ravens in the year 1730. Before Chicago was a city of steel and lights, it was little more than wild land and swamp. Few settlers dared to live there, for the marshes were treacherous, and the woods held secrets whispered by the wind. Among the handful of families that tried to tame this land was Adam Keller, his wife Martha, and their two children, Daniel and Rose. Adam had purchased a stretch of land on the outskirts of a place the locals called Ravens. It was a damp and fog-choked valley, lined with gnarled trees and black marsh water that never seemed to dry. The few traders who crossed the area warned Adam not to build his home there. They spoke of people who had disappeared and of lights that flickered in the woods when the moon was low. Adam dismissed it all as folklore meant to scare the weak-hearted. He was determined to build a life there with his own hands. But from their first night in the cabin, his family felt something was wrong. The first is the hollow was unnaturally quiet at night. Not a single cricket chirped, not even the croak of a frog. The silence was suffocating, and Martha lay awake listening to it. That first night, she heard a faint knock, not on the door, but under the floorboards. She shook Adam awake. "Did you hear that?" she asked. "It's just the wood settling," he replied. But the knocking came again, deliberate and slow, as if something was beneath them. The following evening, Daniel refused to sleep. He sat up in bed, trembling, and told his mother there was a man outside, standing in the fog, watching the house. Martha rushed to the window, but the yard was emptied out. A few days later, little Rose began speaking to someone when no one was around. She would sit in the corner of the room, staring at the wall. "Who are you talking to?" Martha asked. "The man with no eyes," Rose replied with a smile. "He lives under the house." The shadow and Adam brushed off his wife's concerns, but as the nights grew longer, he began to feel the unease himself. One evening, he found deep scratch marks on the outside walls of the cabin, as though something with claws had tried to get in. Daniel woke screaming one night, pointing to the dark corner of his room. "There, he's there, the man in the black hat." Adam grabbed his musket and searched every corner of the cabin, but there was no man. Only the cold feeling that something had been standing there, watching them. The black artist, desperate to understand what was happening, Adam ventured into the marsh at the far end of Raven's Hollow. The air there was thick and heavy, and the ground sucked at his boots. Near the center of the marsh, he found something buried in the mud, an old wooden cross, blackened by age. with strange carvings on it. Beneath it, the remains of a skeleton, its hands positioned as if clawing desperately toward the surface. When Adam returned home that night, the house felt colder than ever. Martha begged him to take the children and leave the hollow behind, but Adam refused. "This is our land," he said. "No ghost or story will drive me away." The final night a storm came that night, fierce and wild. The wind screamed through the trees, and the cabin walls groaned. Daniel clung to his mother, shaking, while Rose sat on the floor, humming to herself, saying that Elias, the man with no eyes, was coming. Adam stood by the door with his musket ready. Then he saw something in the yard, through the cracks of lightning. A tall, gaunt figure wearing a black hat stood perfectly still, facing the house. Its face was pale and smooth, its eye sockets empty and black. The door creaked open by itself. "Adam," Martha whispered, her voice trembling. "Lock it. Lock the door." But Adam stood frozen as the figure stepped inside. "Your blood is mine now," the thing said in a voice that was not human. The candlelight blew out. Screams filled the cabin. The days later, traders passing through Raven's Hollow found the Keller homestead silent. The cabin was empty, the table still set as if the family had been eating when they vanished. Black handprints stained the walls, and the ground beneath the house had been dug up, as though something had crawled out from under it. No one ever saw Adam, Martha, Daniel, or Rose again. Here's the story number 4. Adam Whitmore built his cabin on land most people avoided. It was a stretch of woods so dark and damp that even animals seemed to keep their distance. The air always felt heavier there, as though it carried memories of something terrible. Adam, however, was not a man who believed in ghost tales. He brought his wife, Margaret, and their children, John, 13, and Sarah, 8, determined to create a new life far from the crowded towns. From the moment they arrived, Margaret felt an unease that would not leave her. The trees were black and twisted, and even on sunny days, the shadows stretched across the ground as though they were alive. On their first night in the cabin, she awoke to a strange sound, soft knocking, coming not from the door or the window, but from underneath the floorboards. She shook Adam awake, but he dismissed it, saying the wood was just settling in the cool night air. Still, Margaret kept listening, and the knocking seemed too deliberate to be anything natural. That as days passed, the children began to change. John would stare at the tree line for hours, as if waiting for something to appear. One morning he said, "They call my name from the woods. They want me to go with them." Margaret asked who, and he simply said, "The voices." Sarah, too, began speaking to someone unseen. When asked who it was, she answered, "The pale man. He doesn't like that we are here." Adam tried to ignore these signs, but unease crept into him as well. On the 4th evening, just as the last light of day faded, John pointed outside. "There's someone there," he whispered. Adam grabbed his musket and stepped out into the yard. At the edge of the woods, standing perfectly still, was a tall man wearing a wide black hat. His face was pale and hollow, almost glowing against the dark. The man did not move or speak, but Adam felt the weight of his gaze. When Adam called out, the figure silently stepped back into the mist and vanished. That night, Sarah woke screaming, "He's in my room. The pale man is here." Adam rushed in with the musket, but there was nothing, only the long shadow of the bed cast by the candlelight. As the candle flickered, the shadow stretched unnaturally and seemed to twitch as if alive. Adam felt the hair rise on his neck. The next day, determined to prove the land was safe, Adam walked deep into the woods near the swamp. The ground was wet and soft, pulling at his boots with each step. In a clearing, he discovered an old, half-buried wooden cross, black with age. Beneath it were bones, human bones. They had nails driven through the wrists, as if whoever lay there had been pinned to the earth. Adam returned pale and silent, saying nothing of what he'd found. That night, the knocking beneath the floorboards came again, louder this time, as if something wanted to come inside. Margaret begged him to leave. "This place isn't right," she said. "The children see things. I feel it in my bones. Something lives here." But Adam, stubborn and proud, refused. "We've built this home with our hands. We won't run because of shadows and stories." The shadows, however, no longer stayed in the corners. That night, whispers began to crawl through the walls. At first, they were faint, like the sigh of wind. Then they grew louder, rasping voices speaking in a language none of them understood. Sarah sat upright in her bed, her eyes wide and glassy. "He's coming," she said. "The man with no eyes. He's coming for us." The storm arrived just after midnight. Wind howled through the trees, and the cabin shook. Lightning flashed, illuminating the yard. And there he was, standing near the edge of the woods, the man in the black hat, still and unmoving. The door rattled on its hinges as if something was pushing from outside. John grabbed his father's sleeve. "Pa, don't open it. He wants us to let him in." Adam barred the door, but then the knocking started again, not on the outside, but under the floor, furious and fast, as though 100 fists were pounding beneath them. Sarah covered her ears, crying, "He's under us. He's coming out." Suddenly, the fire blew out. The room was swallowed in darkness. From the corner came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. Adam raised his musket toward the sound. As lightning flashed again, the pale man was inside, standing in the far corner, his face smooth and eyeless, his mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Your blood is mine," the figure said, the voice deep and unnatural, echoing in every corner of the cabin. The door slammed shut on its own. The walls shook as shadows stretched and wrapped around them like black tendrils. Margaret screamed. John grabbed Sarah, but the floor seemed to open beneath their feet, pulling them down into darkness. Adam fired the musket, but the shot was swallowed by the void. When morning came, the cabin was silent. A passing trader found the place empty. The table was set for supper. The chairs toppled over as though the family had left in a panic. Strange black handprints stained the walls. Outside, the mist from the swamp was thicker than ever. No sign of Adam, Margaret, John, or Sarah was ever found at Tio this day. Locals avoid that patch of land. Some say, on foggy nights, you can still see a man in a black hat standing at the edge of the woods, watching silently. Others claim they've heard the sound of knocking coming from beneath the earth, as if something trapped long ago still waits for the next family foolish enough to settle there. Here's a horror story, Hollow Eyes: There was once a man named Elias Brandt who moved his family to a stretch of untamed land far from the safety of towns and settlements. Elias was a man of ambition, determined to build his own home and claim a piece of earth that no one else dared to touch. His wife, Mary, was quiet but strong, a woman who carried herself with a grace that no hardship could break. They had 3 children. Thomas, who was 14 and eager to become a man like his father. Ruth, who was 10 and often lost in her own imagination. And baby Samuel, barely 2 years old. The land they chose was known among traders and hunters as the Black Timber. The trees there grew so tall and close together that sunlight barely reached the ground. Even on clear days, the place felt dim and hushed, like the inside of a cathedral where something ancient and watching lingered in every shadow. Elias had heard rumors about the black timber, that hunters vanished there, that strange lights moved through the trees at night, and that the ground itself sometimes trembled with whispers. But Elias believed in hard work and reason, not in ghost stories. He dismissed the warnings, thinking them nothing more than tales meant to scare the superstitious. From the very first night, Mary knew something was wrong. A strange stillness when the family settled into their newly built cabin. The woods fell silent. There were no crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant animal calls, just a heavy, suffocating stillness that pressed in from all sides. It wasn't the peace of nature, but something deeper, a silence that felt purposeful, like something was holding its breath and waiting. Mary sat near the fire that first evening, rocking baby Samuel to sleep, when she noticed the shadows on the cabin walls. They seemed to move strangely, not quite matching the flicker of the fire. At times, they stretched too far or bent in ways the furniture didn't. She told Elias, but he waved her off. "It's just the firelight playing tricks," he said. "You're tired. Get some rest." But Mary couldn't sleep. She kept hearing faint noises beneath the floorboards, soft scraping sounds like fingernails dragging across the wood. When she bent down to listen, the sound stopped. The next morning, Thomas found something odd near the edge of the clearing. A ring of stones he hadn't seen before, arranged in a perfect circle. The ground inside the circle was black, as if burned, but there were no ashes. He called to his father, who kicked the stones aside. "Kids or travelers must have left it," Elias said. But there were no other settlers within miles. The children began to see by the third night. Ruth began to talk about someone in the woods. "There's a tall man out there," she whispered to Mary as they were preparing for bed. "He has no eyes, Mama. Just dark holes." Mary's heart tightened. "Where did you see him?" "In the trees. He watches the cabin when it gets dark. He stands very still. I saw him yesterday, too, near the well." Mary asked Elias to check the clearing, but when he did, there was no sign of anyone. Later that night, Thomas woke suddenly and told his father that he had heard someone calling his name from outside. The voice, he said, didn't sound human. "It's low, like it's coming from under the ground," Thomas insisted. Elias told both children to stop their stories, but his own nerves were fraying. Every night, he swore he saw something move just at the edge of the tree lean, vanishing when he tried to look directly at it. The man in the shadows one evening, after a long day of cutting wood, Elias stood by the window, watching the tree line. As dusk settled, the mist rolled in, clinging to the ground like smoke. That was when he saw him, a tall figure standing just beyond the clearing. The man wore a black coat and a wide-brimmed hat. His body too thin and his posture too rigid, Elias froze. He couldn't make out the man's face, but he felt the weight of his gaze. Slowly, the man raised a hand, pointing directly at the cabin. Then, without a sound, he stepped backward into the mist and vanished. When Elias told Mary, her face drained of color. "I've seen him too," she whispered. "I thought I was just imagining it." The hidden place the next day, Elias decided to follow the path into the woods. He walked for hours, feeling the weight of the trees pressing in. The air grew colder the deeper he went. He found something strange, an old, rotting structure, half buried in the ground. It wasn't quite a cabin, more like the remains of an altar, covered in markings he didn't understand. The ground around it was covered in bones, animal bones, but some looked far too human. On the largest stone slab, carved deep into the wood, were the words, "We are under watch." The storm that night, the storm came. The wind tore through the trees like screams. The cabin shook. Baby Samuel cried, while Ruth clung to her mother's skirts. The knocking started again, but it wasn't just under the floor. It was on the walls, the ceiling, everywhere at once. Then, as lightning lit up the clearing, the figure was there again, closer this time, standing just a few feet from the window. His hat cast a shadow over his face, but where his eyes should have been, there were only black pits. "He's here," Ruth whispered. "He's coming for us." Elias grabbed his rifle, but the moment he opened the door, the man was gone. Only the storm and the sound of branches breaking remained. The next morning, Thomas was gone. His bed was empty, his boots missing. They searched the woods, calling his name, but found only footprints leading toward the marsh. Near the edge of the swamp, the footprints stopped abruptly, as though he had been lifted into the air. Mary was beside herself with grief. Ruth said she saw Thomas the previous night, standing outside with the man in the hat. He was holding his hand, she said. The final night, by the time night fell again, Mary begged Elias to leave. But Elias refused to abandon the search for his son. As darkness closed in, they heard Thomas's voice outside, calling to them. "Papa, let me in," the voice said. But something about it was wrong, stretched, broken, like several voices speaking at once. When Elias opened the door, there was nothing there. Then the shadow moved. It poured into the cabin like smoke, filling the corners, stretching across the walls. The man with no eyes appeared inside, his face pale, his mouth curling into something that wasn't a smile. "Your blood," he said in a voice that rattled the floor, "is mine now." The lights went out. The screams that followed were never heard by anyone beyond the trees. The next spring, traders passing through found the cabin empty. The table was set as if for dinner. The floor was covered in black handprints. Of the Brandt family, there was no trace. Locals still say that on certain nights, when the mist is thick, you can see a tall man in a black hat standing at the edge of the black timber. If you hear knocking beneath your floor at night, they say, it means he's already inside. All right, another horror story, with deep suspense, dramatic pacing, and unsettling twists. This story will be longer and richer in one piece. The Devil's HW, there was a stretch of wild land where the trees grew darker than anywhere else, and no one built a home nearby. The place had no real name on any map, but the few who passed through called it Devil's Hollow. People avoided it, saying animals went missing there, and sometimes you could hear voices even when no one was around. Jacob Hale had heard these stories, but he was not a man who scared easily. He was a farmer at heart, a man used to hard work and lonely places. When he inherited a forgotten piece of land on the edge of this hollow, he decided he would build a home for his family. With him came his wife, Eliza, and their 3 children. Caleb, aged 15 and strong like his father. Martha, who was 11 and quiet but watchful. And little Henry, who had just turned 5 from the moment they arrived. Eliza felt something strange in the air. It wasn't just the silence of the woods. It was heavier, like the land itself was holding its breath. But Jacob brushed off her concerns. "It's just old woods," he said. "Once we clear a bit, it'll feel like home." Shadows in the trees, the first few days passed without much trouble. They built their cabin, chopped wood, and drew water from the stream nearby. But on the 5th evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, Martha came running inside. "There's someone in the woods," she said, her eyes wide. Jacob stepped outside, but there was no one there. The tree line stood still and dark. Yet, just as he turned to go back inside, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement, like a shadow slipping between the trunks. The next morning, Henry asked Eliza, "Who's the tall man with the hat?" "What man?" she asked, startled. "The one who watches me from the woods. Henry said simply. The first night of fear, it was 2 nights later when things truly began. They had just finished supper when they heard it, a faint tapping, as if someone were knocking on the walls of the cabin from the outside. Jacob grabbed his rifle and circled the house, but he found no one. Then the tapping came again, this time from the floor. Eliza's face turned pale. Jacob tried to reassure the children, but as they slept, he lay awake listening. The sound grew into scratching, like fingernails on wood. By morning, they found long, dark marks on the outside walls, as though something had dragged its claws across the wood during the night. The pale watcher the next evening, Caleb, came rushing in. "Pa," he said breathlessly, "I saw him. There's a man standing at the well." Jacob grabbed his rifle again and stepped outside. By the well stood a tall, thin man wearing a black coat and a wide-brimmed hat. His face was pale, almost white, and where his eyes should have been were two hollow black pits. The man didn't move. "Who are you?" Jacob demanded. The figure tilted its head slowly but did not answer. Then, as Jacob took a step forward, it vanished, dissolving into the air like smoke. The black circle that night, they found something in the yard, a ring of stones arranged in a perfect circle, each one coated in black ash. No one had touched the stones. The family sat silently by the fire, the shadows dancing strangely on the walls. "Jacob," Eliza whispered, "I want to leave. This place isn't safe." "We're not leaving," Jacob said firmly. "It's just tricks, someone trying to scare us off. I won't be run off by a shadow." The storm came a few nights later, wild and furious. The wind tore at the roof, and the cabin shook. Henry cried in Eliza's arms, while Martha stared at the window, whispering that the pale man was outside. Then they all heard it, the slow, heavy footsteps moving across the porch. A voice, low and hollow, came from outside. "Let me in," it said. Jacob shouted back, "Leave us alone." But the door rattled on its hinges, as if unseen hands were trying to tear it open. The tapping from under the floor started again, louder and faster, as if something was trying to crawl through. The disappearance, when the storm ended, Caleb was gone. His bed was empty, his boots missing. Jacob and Eliza searched the woods, but all they found were footprints leading to the black circle of stones. Inside the circle, the ground was scorched, and Caleb's hat lay there, blackened as if burned. Martha said she had seen Caleb the night before, standing outside with the pale man. "He was smiling," she said softly, "but his eyes were all black." The final night, Eliza begged Jacob to leave, but he refused to go without finding his son. As night fell, they heard Caleb's voice outside the cabin, calling, "Pa, let me in." Eliza started toward the door, but Jacob grabbed her. "That's not Caleb," he whispered. The voice came again, louder, warped and broken. "Pa, I'm cold. Open the door." The walls began to shake. The shadows stretched across the room, twisting and writhing. The pale man appeared in the corner, his hollow eyes glowing faintly, his mouth curling into a grotesque smile. "Your blood is mine now," he said in a voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The fire blew out. The cabin was swallowed in darkness. Aftermath. Weeks later, a group of traders passed through Devil's Hollow. They found the Hale cabin abandoned. The table was set for supper, the chairs knocked over. Black handprints stained the walls, and the floor was marked with deep scratches, as if something had clawed its way out. No one ever saw Jacob, Eliza, Martha, or Henry again. And to this day, travelers claim that when the mist is thick, you can see a tall man with a black hat standing near the well, waiting. Story number 7. The arrival. The woods were darker than any the family had seen before. As their wagon creaked along the narrow trail, Branches scraped against the sides like bony fingers. Elias Turner gripped the reins, his jaw set and determined, while his wife, Hannah, sat beside him, clutching their youngest child. Behind them, two more children, Ruth and Benjamin, sat quietly on a pile of blankets, their eyes wide as they stared at the endless trees. "This land will be ours," Elias said, more to himself than anyone else. "No neighbors for miles. We'll build a house here, and in a year's time, it'll be a fine farm." Hannah didn't answer. She couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were watching. It wasn't just her nerves. Even the air felt heavy, as if it carried secrets. Once, she caught sight of a black figure deep among the trees, but when she blinked, it was gone by nightfall. They reached a clearing near a crooked old oak. Elias decided it would be the perfect place for their cabin. As he worked to unload the wagon, Ruth whispered to her mother, "I don't like it here. The trees, they're too quiet." Whispers in the dark the first night. The family slept under the wagon while the fire burned low. At some point in the night, Hannah woke to a faint sound. It was not the wind or an animal, but something softer, like someone whispering just beyond the edge of the clearing. She strained to listen but could not make out the words. The next morning, Elias found a strange symbol drawn in the dirt near the fire pit, a crude circle with 3 lines slashed through it. "Probably kids or travelers playing tricks," he muttered, though he knew there were no neighbors close enough for that. As days turned into weeks, they built a sturdy cabin and cleared part of the land. But every night, Hannah heard the whispers. Sometimes they seemed to come from under the ground itself. One evening, Ruth came inside, pale as chalk. "There's a man standing in the woods," she said, pointing. Elias looked but saw nothing. "He wears a hat," she added softly, "and his face is all white." The shadow man. It was not long before Elias saw him too. While chopping wood, he felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. He turned, and there, between 2 trees, stood a tall, thin man in a black hat and dark coat. His face was wrong, too pale and smooth, like a mask with hollow eye sockets. "Who goes there?" Elias shouted, gripping his axe. The figure tilted its head, but made no sound. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone, melting into the shadows of the trees. That night, Benjamin woke screaming. "He's in my room. The man with the hat. He's watching me." Elias stormed into the children's room with his rifle, but the place was empty. Only a strange chill lingered in the air, and the window was wide open though no one had touched it. The warning Hannah begged Elias to leave the place. "This land isn't right," she whispered. "Something lives here that doesn't want us here." Elias, proud and stubborn, refused. "We worked too hard to leave now. I won't run from a shadow." The next morning, the children found something near the well, an arrangement of stones in a perfect circle, the ground inside blackened as though burned. No one had been outside to make it. That evening, as the sun dipped low, they heard footsteps around the cabin. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Elias threw open the door, but the clearing was empty. Then came the knocking, 3 slow taps from under the floor. Story number 8. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the smell of rain and damp earth. Elias Turner sat at the front of the wagon, the reins loose in his hands, staring down the narrow dirt path that wound deep into the woods. His jaw was set, his eyes full of determination. But behind that determination was something else, a quiet fear he would never admit to his wife or children. Beside him, Hannah Turner cradled their youngest, Emily, while their older 2, Samuel and Ruth, sat silently in the back. The children had been quiet for most of the journey, their faces pale, their eyes darting to the shadows between the trees. The woods seemed to lean in on all sides, the branches clawing at the wagon like blackened fingers. "We're almost there," Elias said. "A little further, and we'll have a place of our own. No landlords, no neighbors, no one to tell us what to do. Just land. Ours." Hannah forced a smile, but her hands tightened around Emily. "I don't like these trees," she murmured. "They feel wrong." Elias snorted. "Trees are trees. You've just been listening to too many of those stories from town. They say the woods are haunted, but I've yet to see a ghost chop firewood or plant corn." Ruth, sitting at the back of the wagon, spoke softly. "Mama, I saw someone back there. A man. He was standing between the trees." Elias slowed the wagon and turned. The road behind them was empty. "It's just your imagination," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You're tired from the trip. We'll rest soon." By dusk, they reached a clearing, a wide, open patch of land surrounded by trees so thick they seemed to form a wall. Elias jumped down from the wagon, looking around with a satisfied smile. "This is it," he said. "This is where we'll build our home." The family unloaded their few belongings while Elias inspected the clearing. The ground was firm, the air still, but Hannah noticed something strange. There were no sounds, not a single bird call or rustle of an animal. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. That night, they made camp beside the wagon. Elias built a fire while the children ate from a small pot of stew. Hannah sat close to the flames, her eyes fixed on the dark tree line. "Do you hear that?" she asked suddenly. "Hear what?" Elias said. "Nothing," she replied. "No animals, no wind. It's too quiet." Elias rolled his eyes. "You're spooking yourself." But later that night, as the fire burned low and the others slept, Hannah woke to a sound. It was faint, almost like a whisper, drifting in from the trees. She sat up, straining to hear. The whisper came again, soft, low, and strange, like words in a language she didn't understand. She clutched Emily closer and stared into the darkness until the first light of dawn broke the horizon. The next day, Elias began to work on clearing the land. He cut trees, split logs, and marked the ground for the cabin. Samuel and Ruth helped gather firewood, while Hannah fetched water from the stream. "Don't go too far," Elias warned her. "These woods are thick, and I don't want anyone getting lost." Hannah nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. As she filled the bucket at the stream, she noticed something on the opposite bank, a ring of stones arranged in a perfect circle. Inside the circle, the ground was blackened, as if burned, but there were no ashes. She backed away, uneasy. When she returned, she told Elias what she had seen. "Probably just an old campfire," he said, dismissing it. "People leave things behind all the time." But Hannah wasn't so sure. That night, as they settled into the wagon, Ruth spoke again. "Mama," she whispered, "he's watching us." "Who?" Hannah asked, brushing her daughter's hair from her face. "The man in the hat," Ruth said. "He stands by the trees. He doesn't move. He just stares." Elias overheard and frowned. "Enough of this nonsense. There's no man. If I see anyone near this camp, I'll handle it." But just before dawn, when Elias woke to add wood to the fire, he saw something that froze his blood. At the far edge of the clearing, between two gnarled oaks, stood a tall figure. He wore a wide black hat and a long coat. His face was pale and smooth, with hollow shadows where eyes should have been. Elias blinked, and the figure was gone. The cabin was built within 2 weeks. It was rough but strong, with a single room for sleeping and a loft for storage. As they moved inside, Hannah hoped the sense of unease would fade, but it only deepened. The woods seemed closer now, their branches scratching against the roof like claws. One evening, as the children played near the fire, Hannah heard a faint tapping. It was slow and deliberate, coming from beneath the floorboards. She froze. "Elias," she whispered. "Do you hear that?" He listened, then shook his head. "It's just the wood settling." But the tapping came again, 3 slow knocks, like someone rapping from below. Over the next days, the strange events multiplied. Ruth woke crying, saying that the man in the hat had been standing in her room. Samuel swore he heard voices outside, calling his name. Even baby Emily would sometimes stare into the corners of the cabin and giggle as if someone unseen was playing with her. One night, Elias decided to keep watch. As the family slept, he sat by the fire with his rifle. Around midnight, he heard footsteps, slow, heavy, circling the cabin. He crept to the window and looked out. The man was there again, standing in the clearing. His black hat cast a shadow over his face, but the hollow pits of his eyes glowed faintly, like embers. Elias shouted and ran outside, but by the time he reached the edge of the yard, the figure had vanished. By the 3rd week, the family was unraveling. Hannah begged Elias to leave. "This place is cursed," she whispered. "It doesn't want us here." Elias, stubborn and proud, refused. "We built this with our own hands. I won't run because of shadows and whispers." But even he could no longer ignore the signs. That night, the knocking beneath the floor became louder, more violent. It shook the cabin, and the children screamed. Suddenly, all the candles went out at once, plunging them into darkness. In the blackness, they heard it, the voice. It was low, rasping, and unnatural, as though coming from everywhere at once. "Leave this place," it said, "or your blood will feed the ground." The next morning, Elias went to the well for water. There, lying on the ground beside it, was a small wooden doll. It was crudely carved, but its face was pale, and its eyes were nothing but black holes. When he touched it, the wood felt warm, as though it had been held by unseen hands only moments ago. That night, they did not sleep. The night stretched long and heavy, as if time itself had slowed. Elias sat at the table with his rifle across his lap, his face pale and drawn. Hannah sat on the floor with Emily in her arms, rocking her gently as the baby fussed and whimpered, sensing the fear in the room. Ruth and Samuel huddled close together near the fire, their wide eyes fixed on the darkened corners of the cabin. "Elias," Hannah said quietly, "we can't stay here any longer. I don't care about the farm. I don't care about the land. We have to leave." Elias shook his head. "At first light, I'll look around. Maybe someone's playing tricks, trying to scare us away so they can take the land for themselves. I'm not about to run without knowing what we're dealing with." "This isn't a trick," Hannah whispered, her voice trembling. "I've felt it since we arrived. It's this place. It doesn't want us here. Something lives here, Elias." Elias didn't answer. He kept his eyes fixed on the window, scanning the tree line. Outside, the mist rolled in, thick and ghostly, wrapping around the trees and swallowing the moonlight. The woods looked alive, as if they were breathing. The figure returned near midnight. Samuel stirred and pointed toward the window. "Pa," he whispered, "he's back. The man with the hat." Elias rose slowly, rifle in hand, and stepped to the window. There, at the far edge of the clearing, stood the figure. The pale man. His black coat hung like tattered shadows, and the wide-brimmed hat cast his face in darkness. But the hollow, glowing pits where his eyes should have been burned in the night. "Who are you?" Elias shouted through the window. "What do you want?" The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. Elias flung open the door and stepped outside. the cold mist curling around his boots. "I'm warning you," he barked, raising the rifle. But when he took a step forward, the man seemed to dissolve into the fog, as if he'd never been there at all. The scratching Elias barely slept. When dawn broke, he went to the well to fetch water, but what he found stopped him cold. Scratched into the wooden frame of the well, deep and jagged, were the words, "Leave or feed the earth." He tried to hide it from Hannah and the children, but Ruth saw it anyway. She said nothing, only stared at the words with wide, fearful eyes. That evening, as the family sat eating their supper, they heard the sound again, tapping, slow and deliberate, from beneath the floor. Elias stood, his chair scraping back. "Enough," he muttered, grabbing a lantern. He pried up one of the floorboards near the fireplace, but there was nothing beneath it but dirt and stones. The tapping stopped. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, the sound returned, scratching this time, as though something with sharp claws was raking across the underside of the floor. Hannah sat up in bed, clutching Emily. "Elias, please," she whispered, "let's go. Tonight. We'll take the wagon and leave this place behind." But Elias couldn't bring himself to answer. He just stared at the door, listening to the scratching grow louder. The voice, it was just past midnight when Samuel woke screaming. Elias and Hannah rushed into the children's room to find Samuel standing at the window, his eyes wide and glassy. "He's calling me," Samuel whispered. "The man in the hat. He says I have to come with him." Elias grabbed his son's shoulders. "You're not going anywhere. Do you hear me?" But then they all heard it. A voice, deep and hollow, coming from outside. "Come," it said. "Come to me, boy." Ruth started crying, hiding her face against Hannah's side. Elias snatched up his rifle and threw open the door. The mist was so thick it was hard to see, but there he was, the pale man, standing at the edge of the yard. Elias aimed his rifle and fired. The shot rang out like thunder, but the figure didn't fall. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as though curious. And then, in an instant, it vanished. The next morning, Elias found something new in the yard. The circle of stones had returned, perfectly arranged in front of the cabin's door. In the center of the circle was a dead crow, its eyes missing, its wings splayed out unnaturally. Hannah saw it and gasped. "This is a warning," she said. "Elias, we have to leave now, before it's too late." But Elias, stubborn as ever, kicked the stones aside and buried the crow. "I'm not afraid of some tricks." The second night of terror that night, the pale man came closer. Hannah saw him through the window, standing just a few feet from the porch. His face was pale and smooth, like wax. Where his eyes should have been were hollow black pits, and his mouth curved into a smile that didn't look human. Elias barred the door and windows, but the knocking came again, this time from the walls themselves. First one knock, then another, then a slow, deliberate scratching, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. The children clung to Hannah, sobbing. Elias stood in the center of the room, rifle raised, his eyes darting to every shadow. "Show yourself," he roared. The fire suddenly went out. Darkness swallowed the cabin. And then came the voice again, deep and cold and everywhere at once. "Your blood will feed the earth." The next morning when the sun rose, they were all exhausted. Elias finally admitted what Hannah had been saying all along. "We're leaving," he said. "Pack what you can. We're gone before nightfall." They worked quickly, loading the wagon with what little they had. But when Elias went to hitch the horses, he froze. The animals were dead, their eyes missing, their bodies twisted as though something had drained them of life. Hannah screamed when she saw them. Ruth and Samuel cried. Elias stood there in silence, gripping the wagon for support. "We can't leave," Hannah said, her voice shaking. "We're trapped." The pale man enters that night. They stayed inside, praying for morning. But just past midnight, the door creaked open on its own. Elias grabbed his rifle and aimed at the entrance. The pale man stepped inside. His presence filled the room like a cold wind. His black coat seemed to blend into the shadows, and his hollow eyes burned like dark coals. He smiled, though it wasn't a smile meant for kindness. "Your time is done," he said in a voice that rattled the floorboards. "The earth is hungry." Elias fired, but the shot passed through the figure as though through smoke. The pale man raised one long, bony hand and pointed at Samuel. The pale man's finger, long and thin like a skeletal branch, pointed directly at Samuel. The boy whimpered, clutching his mother's dress, his small body trembling. "No!" Elias roared, stepping between the figure and his son, his rifle raised. "You leave my family alone." The pale man's head tilted slowly, unnaturally, as though his neck had no bones to stop its movement. His hollow eyes seemed to sink deeper into his face, and when he spoke, his voice rolled like thunder, cold and sharp. "You built your house on cursed earth. It is mine, and now you are mine." Suddenly, every door and shutter in the cabin slammed shut at once. The fire in the hearth flared to life, burning black and crackling like whispers. Elias pulled the trigger again, but the rifle misfired, the bullet never leaving the chamber. The pale man stepped closer. With each step, the floorboards groaned, though he did not seem to touch them. Hannah screamed, pulling Samuel and Ruth into the far corner, clutching baby Emily close to her chest. "Stay back." Elias shouted, swinging the rifle like a club. The pale man's smile widened into something inhuman. He lifted his hand slowly, and the rifle ripped itself from Elias's grip, flying across the room and crashing into the wall. Elias fell to his knees, gasping, as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. The vanishing of Samuel, the pale man's gaze shifted back to Samuel. "The boy," he said, "belongs to the hollow now." "No," Hannah cried. She ran forward, placing herself between Samuel and the figure. "You can't take him. Take me instead." The pale man's head tilted again. His hand brushed over her face without touching her, and a cold so sharp it burned made her scream and stumble back. Elias tried to grab Samuel, but the boy's feet were rooted to the ground, his eyes wide and glassy as though he were hypnotized. "Samuel, run!" Elias shouted, but Samuel's lips trembled as if speaking words he didn't understand. "He's calling me, Papa. I have to go with him." "No, you don't," Elias bellowed, grabbing his son and shaking him. The pale man whispered something in a language none of them knew, and suddenly, Samuel's body was yanked from Elias's arms as though pulled by invisible chains. He screamed as he was dragged across the floor toward the door, which swung open on its own. Elias lunged, but the door slammed shut, leaving them in silence. Samuel was gone. The aftermath, Hannah collapsed, sobbing into her hands. Ruth screamed for her brother, her voice breaking. Baby Emily wailed, her cries echoing through the cabin. Elias stood frozen, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with shock. He ran to the door and tore it open, but the clearing outside was empty. Only the mist remained, swirling like a living thing. "Samuel," he shouted. "Samuel, answer me." There was no reply, only the whisper of the wind and a faint echo of laughter, low, hollow, and distant. Elias turned back to his wife. "I'll find him," he said, his voice rough and trembling. "I don't care what that thing is. I'll bring our boy home." "Elias, no," Hannah begged. "Please, we can't go out there. It wants us out there. You'll never come back." Elias grabbed his axe and a lantern. I'll die before I let that thing take him. The woods at night, the forest swallowed him whole. The light from the lantern barely reached beyond a few feet, and the trees seemed to lean closer the further he walked. Every sound, every snapping branch and rustling leaf, made him whip around, but nothing was ever there. Samuel, he called, his voice breaking. Samuel, answer me. Somewhere, far off, came a whisper. It sounded like his son's voice, calling, Papa. Elias ran toward it, the lantern swinging wildly. But as he moved deeper into the woods, the ground changed beneath his feet. The soil was black and damp, the air heavy with the stench of decay. Then he saw it, a circle of stones, just like the one near the cabin. In the center stood Samuel, motionless, his head bowed. Samuel, Elias cried, rushing forward. But as he crossed the circle, everything changed. The forest around him dissolved into darkness. The sky turned blood red, and the trees were gone, replaced by twisted, skeletal shapes that pulsed as if alive. The ground squirmed beneath his feet like wet flesh. Samuel raised his head. His eyes were black, empty voids. It's too late, Papa, he said, his voice layered with whispers. He owns me now. The world beyond, a figure emerged from the darkness, taller now, more monstrous. The pale man's face stretched unnaturally, his hollow eyes glowing like coals. You trespassed on my land, the figure said. The hollow takes what it's owed. Take me instead, Elias begged, dropping to his knees. Take my life, my soul, anything. Just give me back my boy. The pale man laughed, a sound like dry leaves breaking. Your blood will join us soon enough. All of you will. This land hungers for families like yours. Always has. Elias lunged with the axe, but the blade passed through the figure as though it were smoke. The pale man's hand closed around Elias's throat, cold as death. Elias gasped and choked, his vision going black. When he woke, he was lying outside the circle. Samuel was gone. Back at the cabin, Elias stumbled back to the cabin, half delirious. Hannah ran to him. Where's Samuel? Did you find him? Elias couldn't speak. He collapsed to his knees, the lantern slipping from his hand. He's gone, he whispered. God forgive me, he's gone. Ruth cried herself to sleep that night, clutching her mother's arm. Hannah sat awake, staring into the fire with wide, haunted eyes. Elias sat at the table, the axe in front of him, his hands shaking. The final warning near midnight. The voice came again, this time from within the cabin itself. Leave this place, or you'll join him. The walls shook. Black handprints formed on the wood, appearing out of nowhere, as if pressed by unseen hands. The fire burned higher, and shadows twisted across the floor, forming shapes of screaming faces. Hannah grabbed Elias's arm. We have to go? Now. I don't care if we walk until our feet bleed. If we stay, we'll all die. Elias looked at her, at Ruth, at baby Emily. His jaw tightened. At first light, he said. We leave at first light. But deep down, he knew it was already too late. The last night, the night felt heavier than any before. The wind howled through the trees like voices crying out. The fire in the cabin flickered and spat, its light barely keeping the darkness at bay. Hannah sat with Ruth, and Emily clutched close, her eyes darting to every shadow. Elias sat at the table, his axe across his knees, his face pale and sunken. We leave when the sun rises, he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. Hannah shook her head. If we wait until morning, there will be no morning for us. Elias wanted to argue, but then the sound came. It was faint at first, a slow, rhythmic thumping, like footsteps dragging along the porch. Ruth whimpered and buried her face in her mother's dress. Then came the voice. Elias. It was Samuel's voice, sweet and familiar, but warped, stretched, as though someone else were speaking through it. Papa, I'm cold. Let me in. Elias stood, his chest tightening. Samuel? Hannah grabbed his arm. It's not him. You know it's not him. The voice came again, louder this time. Papa, please, let me in. The knocking began, soft at first, then violent, shaking the door on its hinges. Elias gripped the axe tighter, his mind screaming at him to ignore it. But the voice, that voice sounded so much like his boy. The knocking stopped. Silence filled the cabin, heavy and suffocating. Then, without warning, the door creaked open on its own. Hannah screamed. Ruth clutched her mother tighter, her small fingers digging into Hannah's arm that on the porch stood Samuel. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were bottomless pits of black. He smiled, but it wasn't Samuel's smile. It was too wide, too wrong. Papa, he said softly, come with me. Elias's knees buckled. His boy stood there, but everything in him screamed it wasn't real. What have they done to you? He whispered. The pale man stepped into view behind Samuel, his tall, shadowy figure looming like death itself. One has gone, he said. Two remain. Then the hollow will sleep again. The attack Elias raised the axe and swung with all his strength, aiming for the pale man. But the figure dissolved into smoke, reappearing behind him. A cold hand grabbed Elias's shoulder, and he was thrown across the room as though he weighed nothing. He slammed into the wall, pain shooting through his back. Hannah screamed, "Stay away from us." The pale man turned his hollow gaze toward her. The shadows of the cabin came alive, crawling along the walls like black vines. They reached for Hannah, for Ruth, for baby Emily. No, Elias roared, forcing himself to his feet. He charged forward, swinging wildly. The axe hit something solid this time. The pale man shrieked, a sound that made the air tremble, and for a moment, the shadows withdrew. Run! Elias shouted. Hannah, take the girls and run. The escape attempt. Hannah grabbed Ruth's hand and clutched Emily against her chest. She bolted for the door, her bare feet pounding the wooden floor. Elias followed, still swinging the axe at the creeping shadows that clawed at them. They ran into the clearing, the mist thick and choking. The pale man's voice boomed behind them. You cannot leave. You belong to me. The ground trembled as though the earth itself were alive. Roots shot up from the soil, twisting like snakes, trying to snare their ankles. Elias swung the axe, hacking through the roots. Keep running. But the wagon was still too far. The horses were dead, their bodies cold and stiff, and there was no way out but on foot. The circle of stones, they stumbled into the clearing near the well and froze. The circle of stones had returned, but this time it glowed faintly, as though lit from beneath the earth. In its center stood Samuel, smiling that hollow smile. Don't step inside, Hannah gasped. Elias gritted his teeth, tightening his grip on the axe. Give me back my son. The pale man appeared beside Samuel. He is mine now, as you will be. The hollow must eat. Elias roared and charged. The pale man raised his hand, and a blast of cold wind knocked Elias to the ground, the axe flying from his grasp. He struggled to get up as roots coiled around his legs, dragging him toward the circle. The sacrifice. Hannah screamed and ran forward, clutching Emily tight. Take me, she cried. Take me instead. Let them go. The pale man turned his hollow gaze toward her. A mother's soul is sweet, he said, but the hollow craves them all. Ruth, trembling, picked up a rock from the ground and hurled it at the figure. It passed right through him, But the act distracted him just long enough for Elias to grab the axe again. With a roar, Elias swung, severing the roots that bound his legs. He charged into the circle, scooping Samuel into his arms. For a moment, he felt his boy again, warm and solid. But then Samuel screamed, his voice not his own, and Elias felt something icy tearing into his chest, like claws raking through his heart. The final confrontation, Elias fell to his knees, gasping. He looked up at the pale man, who now towered over him, his smile wider than ever. "You cannot win," the figure whispered. "You will all feed the hollow." Elias's eyes darted to Hannah, to Ruth, to Emily. He knew what he had to do. With his last strength, he hurled the axe, not at the pale man, but at the glowing stones. The blade shattered one of the stones, and the glow vanished. The ground shook violently, the mist swirling like a storm. The pale man let out a scream that split the air, his form flickering like a dying flame. "Run!" Elias shouted. Now, the end of Elias. Hannah grabbed the children and ran, not looking back. She heard Elias screaming, heard the earth swallow him, but she couldn't stop. She ran until her legs gave out, until the trees thinned and the first light of dawn touched the horizon. When she finally looked back, the clearing was gone. The hollow had swallowed everything. The cabin, the well, even the path they had taken. Hannah collapsed, clutching her daughters, her heart breaking. Samuel was gone. Elias was gone. But they were alive. For now. Epilogue. Years later, travelers passing through the woods spoke of a place where the air grew cold and the mist never lifted. Some claimed they heard a man's voice shouting for his son, or a child crying in the distance. And on certain nights, when the moon was low, they said they saw him, a tall, pale man in a black hat, standing among the trees, watching, waiting,